So today we're just going to speak about two interesting questions or cases that we've been dealing with recently. Do you want to have a go first?
Yeah. So my interesting case for the week is obviously it's now January, the end of January. We've gone through the December period now. For those of you who are landlords or those who are interested, December, January is always a fascinating time for a property practitioner. It is by far the time of the year where all the weird things come out. And one of the things that we do get on occasion, I've experienced this week, is a tenant who seemingly over the December period, they obviously went on leave, on holiday, and now they're not back. They haven't come back to the premises. It looks like they vacated the premises. And I received a question this week from a landlord going, well, what do I do in the circumstances? And it's a good question. It does happen on occasion where tenants vacate a premises and they just never come back and they've absconded from that premises. Either because, they're trying to avoid their obligations or they're just tired of the particular agreement. Or alternatively, you do have to be careful over the December, January period because there are a lot of companies that obviously go on leave, they close down. And just because there's no one walking in and out of the door during a particular period does not necessarily mean that they've abandoned that particular property. And obviously, you want to be very careful about things, especially during this period, to make sure you don't do something like go ahead and break back into your premises. Meanwhile,
so just to clarify, this is a commercial property.
Yes. So the one that I'm talking about is commercial, but I'm going to deal with a little bit of both sides,
Sure.
just because they differentiate slightly. So to start with the residential sphere, the residential sphere is a little bit nicer because we do have a provision sitting within the Rental Housing Act which deals with circumstances where your tenant does vacate the premises. Okay. And in those circumstances, the Rental Housing Act in section 530 basically says that if a tenant vacates the dwelling before the expiration of the lease agreement without notice, then the lease agreement is going to be deemed to have ended at the point where the landlord finds out about the vacation of the tenant. So at that point, your lease agreement now comes to an end. You as a landlord can then go ahead, market your premises for another tenant. And of course, due to the early cancellation of the lease agreement, there is a damages claim which you could potentially have as a result of the early cancellation of the particular lease agreement. So there's a nice provision that wraps it up for us in the residential sphere.
And what about dealing with possible assets inside? Is that where you're going to next?
So there's the real trick. Obviously, there is a question as to whether this tenant has actually absconded from the premises or not. And I want to be very careful for our listeners when you start making assumptions about this, okay? Because if say you've got a very, very, very intense case where absolutely everything is gone, you've opened up that premises and there is not a cup left inside that particular premises, you might be able to go under the assumption that the tenant has in fact vacated the particular premises. However, it's very rare that is the type of circumstance that you experience. What we generally experience when a tenant does vacate a premises is a lot of the important stuff that they own is gone, but there are assets that are still situated within the premises when you walk in there. Okay. And now the difficult part about this particular case is a tenant can perfectly well say go on holiday and take all of their clothing with them, but not take whatever other assets are sitting within the premises. So how do you make this distinction between have they vacated, have they not vacated? All right. It really, there's no hard and fast way. And often when we get these questions from clients, they say, well, have they gone?
Yeah.
The question is, we don't know. It depends on the circumstances of the particular situation. What are the kind of assets that are still sitting within the particular premises? If someone's left their TV in a particular premises, it's likely they're going to come back. And that if a TV's gone, that might be a good indicator that they're not going to come back. But again, these are not hard and fast rules.
Like the TV is the important one.
It might be the thing. It's one of those assets that has a little bit of value.
Yeah.
That it's unlikely someone's just going to leave it behind. Whereas stuff like a desk or a random chair, those are assets which are left behind in a premises almost every single time someone moves out.
Because they're willing to give it away. Sometimes you find it on the street. People like abandon it very easily. They've got no. Yeah, I get you.
100%. They've got very little value.
Or PC or something. Yeah.
That's it. They've got very little value if you on-sell them a desk or a random chair, and they are exceedingly annoying to move around.
Sure.
You know, they cost a lot of money to move from one place to another. So you'll find those type of assets are left in
Sure.
properties. It really depends on the question. Again, when it comes to these things, if you are unsure as a landlord, has my tenant vacated or not? Okay, for whatever reason, we obviously caution and say stay on the side of safety. If this tenant hasn't paid you the rental and there is still assets within that particular premises, you're not sure whether they've actually absconded or not, go the eviction route. Okay, you want to be careful about assuming that your tenant is gone, going in there, getting rid of all their assets, putting in a new tenant in the premises, and you open yourself up for a damages claim for the loss of the tenant's property, or even worse, you know, the balance of the lease agreement, which you now can't perform in terms of because you've placed another tenant in the premises. So be careful, make sure if you don't know whether that's actually happened, is there possible cancellation? Do you need to get in touch with the tenant to find out exactly what's happened? And obviously, you know, communicate with your tenants. A simple phone call can clear up the issue quite nicely, even if there is some tension between yourself and the particular tenant. So that's the residential side. Commercial side is similar. However, the one thing we must remember about commercial lease agreements is that there is no overriding legislation with regards to commercial lease agreements. So while we're still in the same position where you need to do an interpretation on, has the tenant really vacated the premises? What is left within the premises? Is there stuff of value which you know, may indicate that the tenant is going to come back? There's no assumption in law that the lease agreement comes to an end at the point where it is deemed that the tenant has vacated the premises. So you as a commercial landlord are going to have to make an additional step there to make sure that there's a formal cancellation of the particular lease agreement. Obviously, if a tenant does vacate a premises, if they completely vacate, it is conduct which shows that the tenant is not intended to be bound by the terms of the lease agreement. So they're not gonna occupy that space. They're not going to look after it. They're not going to comply with the terms of the lease agreement. Okay, and this is conduct which we call a repudiation of the lease agreement, i.e., it's simple conduct that shows I'm not going to be bound by the terms of the lease. And if you are the commercial landlord in those particular circumstances, you are entitled to accept the repudiation by the tenant and bring the lease agreement to an end, in which case you will have a damages claim for the early cancellation of the lease agreement. But that election has to be made by you as a landlord and has to be communicated over to the tenant to say, I've elected to accept the repudiation. Your alternative is you reject the repudiation. So you say, no, you know, you've indicated that you don't want to be bound by the lease agreement. I'm not accepting that. I need you to comply with the terms of your particular lease agreement and continue to perform in terms of the lease agreement. So those are our two sort of situations. The one thing about this, you know, it's the question that we get every year when, you know, tenants perhaps disappear. Have they gone? What can I do? It really depends on the circumstances of each particular case, and what the particular situation looks like for you.
Yeah. So just a couple of interesting questions, maybe. We dealt with this before in a different episode, but it ties in quite well. I believe in that one, the tenant continued to pay rent, but he was arrested, so he'd been gone for quite some time, but there was still a certain amount of possession because rent had been paid. So, I mean, does that impact the landlord's rights, or is the landlord bound by the lease given that the rent is being paid?
So from my point of view, obviously, you know, when you sign a lease agreement with a particular tenant, okay, unless you've got very specific provisions within the lease agreement, it's not required that the tenant is in occupation of the premises at all possible moments. All right. For instance, over the December period, you've got your tenants in occupation. They decide they're going to take a 3-week holiday, down to the coast or whatever the case is, and they're not going to be staying at the particular leased premises during that period. The fact that the tenant is not, staying there overnight or visiting the premises on a daily basis does not mean that you can, as the landlord, come in and cancel the lease agreement because they're not actually occupying that particular premises. All right. Sure. It's obviously a situation where something else is happening. And, you can perfectly well rent a premises that you don't occupy yourself. If we have a look at our student lease agreements, that exist within our economy, often parents sign a lease agreement with their name on, but the intention is for their children or, students to occupy the premises through them. So if you have a situation where a tenant is paying their rental on a monthly basis, but they don't necessarily occupy the premises, in my view, that is still conduct indicative that the tenant intends to be bound by the lease agreement. And you as landlord, notwithstanding the fact that the tenant is maybe not going in and out of that particular premises every day, you've got to abide by the terms of the lease agreement and allow them occupation for whatever period they come back to that particular premises.
And what's interesting about that is if you then turn to the commercial space, so we had a case at a stage that caused quite a few problems because the possession, or rather non-activity, or inactivity, that's the word, inactivity, of a tenant on a commercial premises inside a retail park that was supposed to be bustling. That turned on its head because the tenant kept paying rent, but it took them a while to get the ball rolling with certain things. So it wasn't abscondment as much as getting the operations up and running. And it caused a massive issue where the landlord came and said, well, we can't have this because everyone relies on foot traffic. We're very particular on what tenants we take on because we want people moving through the center. An empty shop looks bad. It looks abandoned. It makes it look poor or whatever, like places are closing down. It doesn't give us that confidence. So it is just interesting how different the retail space is obviously to the residential space.
Yes, and it's why you need, when it comes to lease agreements that you have in place with your particular tenants, it's why you need a lease agreement that is not generic or just a simple thing. It's something that needs to take account of the situation that you're in. So a lot of your retail landlords, your big guys that have shopping centers, have very specific clauses which you won't see in your commercial space or your residential space, which basically says you need to have opened within a certain period and have foot traffic, going in and out within a certain period, and you need to keep your doors open between certain hours on weekdays and weekends. And those are very specific provisions which are included in the lease agreement, which if the tenant doesn't uphold them and doesn't comply with them, obviously constitutes a breach of the lease agreement.
And on the last point, this was some kind of practical experience. Like Nick mentioned, it's almost impossible to figure out whether there's been abscondment or not. It's so difficult. And if you get it wrong, that's exactly where the damages cases come in. Obviously, phoning, making inquiries, yes, it might take a little bit of time, but you might need to really try to figure out what's happening. And if you go into the premises and it looks like it's half empty and now you're not 100% sure, obviously the safest bet is to do like an eviction application. I have had some landlords that opted not to and said, look, what's the best way to mitigate any potential damage? I don't want to do an eviction, but I'm convinced that they've absconded. I'll take the risk, right? And in those instances, obviously, with a lot of guidance, I always suggest that independent third party attend if you're going to safely remove the assets out of the premises. They need to be stored safely. The third party is there to create an inventory. So sometimes one of my candidate attorneys will go, or even his accountant, or someone completely impartial, a professional that can depose to an affidavit, attach it, and go, these were the items. This is it. This is all that was there, and now it's being stored there, because you don't want a situation. Yes, it might be spoliation to lock the door, change the locks or something, but he wasn't in the premises, and if he asks, you can put him in possession relatively quickly. It's now removing the assets and now being blamed for stealing assets or damaging assets or things like that. So you need to treat it very, very carefully, store it safely up until the point where if there's storage costs, you can sell it in execution to cover the storage costs. There's something that you would have to do in future, but just be very careful on how you handle what you perceive to be an actual abscondment. There needs to be like due care taken there as well.